Royal Guard sees a homeless man holding a sign in the crowd. When he reads the message, he breaks down in tears. What happens next will leave you speechless. This story of love, sacrifice, and hidden truths will touch your heart in ways you never expected. Don't forget to like, share, and let us know where you're watching from. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Marcus stood at attention, his polished boots planted firmly on the cobblestones. For 7 years, he had worn the Royal Guard's uniform with unwavering pride. His chest rose and fell beneath the crisp red jacket adorned with gleaming brass buttons, each breath measured and controlled just as he had been trained. The crowd pressed against the barriers, their excitement building as they awaited the king's arrival. Marcus had seen thousands of faces during his time as a guard, but he never really looked at them. That was part of his training, to see everything while appearing to see nothing, to remain stoic, unmoved, unshakable. But today was different. Today something pulled at the corners of his awareness, like a loose thread that wouldn't stop tickling the back of his neck. At first he tried to ignore it, maintaining his forward stare as the trumpets announced the approaching royal procession. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. Then he saw him. In the sea of well-dressed citizens and eager tourists, a figure stood out like a smudge on a pristine painting. An elderly man in tattered clothes, his gray beard unkempt and his eyes deep-set in a weathered face. He clutched a cardboard sign close to his chest, but Marcus couldn't make out the words. Something about the man's stance, the way he held himself despite his ragged appearance, spoke of dignity lost, rather than dignity never possessed. The old man's eyes locked onto Marcus with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Those eyes? There was something hauntingly familiar about them. The same shade of green as his own, flecked with gold around the pupils. Marcus had seen those eyes before, but where? A memory flickered at the edges of his mind, like a candle flame struggling against the wind. A much younger version of those eyes, crinkled with laughter as strong hands lifted him high into the air. The scent of pine needles and wood smoke, a deep voice singing old war songs. But as quickly as the memory surfaced, it slipped away, leaving Marcus with nothing but an ache in his chest he couldn't explain. "That old beggar's back again," muttered James, the guard stationed next to him. "Been showing up at every royal event for the past 3 years, always staring at the guards like he's searching for someone." Marcus's throat tightened. 3 years? How had he never noticed him before? The old man took a step forward, his movements careful and deliberate. The sign in his hands trembled slightly as he began to raise it. Marcus fought against every instinct to turn his head, to get a better look at what was written there. The first word came into view. I ... Then another step, another word revealed, was ... Marcus's heart began to pound against his ribs. Each beat a hammer, strike against his carefully maintained composure. The old man's lips moved, forming words Marcus couldn't hear, over the crowd's growing cheers. Just then, the royal trumpets blared their commanding notes, forcing Marcus to snap his attention back to his duties. The king was approaching, his gilded carriage rolling slowly down the parade route. But, for the first time in his career as a royal guard, Marcus found himself struggling to focus on his sacred duty. Because in that brief moment when their eyes had met, the old man had whispered something, a name, not Marcus, the name he used now, but a different name, a secret name, one that only 2 people in the world had ever known. One of those people was Marcus himself. The other was his father, who had vanished without a trace 15 years ago, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a grief that had shaped Marcus into the unshakable guard he was today. Or at least, the unshakable guard he had been until this very moment. The crowd's cheers faded into a distant hum as Marcus struggled to maintain his composure. Every muscle in his body urged him to turn, to look again at those familiar eyes that had stirred something deep within his soul. The old man's presence felt like a weight pressing against his chest, making each breath more difficult than the last. Through years of training, Marcus had learned to stand perfectly still for hours, but now his fingers twitched against his weapon. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. The name the old man had whispered, Tommy, echoed in his mind like a forgotten lullaby. Nobody had called him Tommy since that terrible night 15 years ago, when his world had shattered into pieces too sharp to hold. The old man shuffled closer to the barrier, his movements slow but purposeful. Marcus caught glimpses of him in his peripheral vision, each flash sending another jolt of recognition through his body. The cardboard sign wavered in the man's trembling hands, and Marcus could now see more words appearing. Once, where? Stand straight, Marcus, James whispered from beside him, noticing his slight falter. King's almost here. But Marcus barely heard him. His mind raced through fragments of memories he'd buried long ago. His father's strong hands showing him how to hold a sword. The proud smile when Marcus had first expressed his dream of joining the royal guard. The warmth of their small house on the edge of the kingdom, filled with the scent of his father's favorite stew. Then came the darker memories, the whispered arguments he'd overheard late at night, his father's increasingly worried expressions, the mysterious visitors who spoke in hushed tones, the final morning when his father had hugged him extra tight, promising to return by sunset. But sunset had come and gone, and his father never returned. The official story was that his father, a decorated warrior, had died heroically in battle. Young Marcus had clung to that story, using it as fuel to follow in his father's footsteps. He'd trained harder than anyone else, determined to honor his father's memory by becoming the perfect royal guard. He'd pushed away the doubts, the questions, the inconsistencies in the story he'd been told. But now, watching the old man from the corner of his eye, those doubts came rushing back. The way the man held himself, despite his ragged appearance, spoke of military training, the careful positioning of his feet, the straight line of his shoulders even beneath the worn clothes. It was all too familiar. The king's carriage drew closer, its golden ornaments catching the morning light. Marcus knew he should be focused entirely on his duty, scanning the crowd for threats, maintaining the dignity of his position. Instead, his attention kept drifting to the sign, now partially visible. I was once where... A child in the crowd dropped a balloon, and its sudden pop made several people jump. In that moment of distraction, the old man's eyes met Marcus's again, and this time, there was no mistaking the intention behind his gaze. Those eyes held years of pain, of longing, of desperate hope. The man's lips moved again, forming words too quiet to hear over the crowd. My son. Marcus's training warred with his instincts. Every fiber of his being wanted to step forward, to demand answers, to understand why those eyes haunted him so deeply. But the weight of his uniform, the responsibility of his position, held him rooted to the spot. Something's wrong with that beggar, James muttered, his hand tightening on his weapon. Should we remove him from the crowd? The suggestion sent a spike of panic through Marcus's chest. Remove him? Before he could read the full message? Before he could understand why this man knew his childhood name? Before he could unravel the mystery that had plagued his dreams for 15 years? The royal carriage was now only meters away. In moments, it would pass directly in front of them, and all eyes would be on the guards. Marcus had dreamed of this moment throughout his training, standing proud as the king passed, being the perfect example of royal guard discipline. But now, for the first time in his career, Marcus found himself hoping for something to delay the king's arrival. Just a few more minutes to read the sign, a few more moments to understand why his heart seemed to recognize this stranger, while his mind still struggled to make sense of it all. The old man took another step forward, and the sign tilted slightly in the morning light. More words became visible. I was once where you... A sharp blast from the royal trumpet pierced the air, making Marcus flinch, the first visible break in his composure since joining the guard. The sound seemed to shatter the strange spell that had fallen over him, forcing his attention back to the approaching royal carriage. His training kicked in automatically, shoulders squaring, chin lifting, eyes forward. But his mind refused to follow his body's discipline. Every heartbeat seemed to echo with questions that had haunted him since childhood. Why had his father never returned that day? Why had the official story felt so wrong? Why had his mother's eyes always held a shadow of doubt when she spoke of his father's supposed heroic death? The crowd's excitement swelled as the king's carriage drew nearer. Through the corner of his eye, Marcus caught glimpses of the old man struggling to maintain his position as people pushed forward, eager to catch a glimpse of royalty. The cardboard sign wavered, its full message still tantalizingly out of view. Remember your oath, James whispered beside him, misinterpreting Marcus's tension as mere nerves. "Nothing breaks our focus. Nothing." Marcus wanted to laugh at those words. For 7 years, he had lived by that oath. He had stood guard through storms and celebrations, through threats and festivities. He had earned his reputation as the most disciplined member of the royal guard. But now, a single whispered name from a stranger's lips had cracked his foundation like ice in spring. The old man stumbled as someone bumped into him, nearly dropping his sign. Without thinking, Marcus's hand twitched, instinctively wanting to reach out and steady him. The movement was tiny, barely noticeable, but it was enough to draw James's concerned glance. "Marcus," James hissed, "what's gotten into you?" What had gotten into him? The question echoed in his mind as memories flooded back. Memories he'd locked away years ago. The last breakfast with his father, how he'd made Marcus's favorite honey bread. The extra tight hug before leaving. The strange tremor in his voice when he'd said, "Remember, Tommy, sometimes things aren't what they seem. Sometimes the truth wears a mask." At the time, Marcus hadn't understood those words. He'd been too young, too innocent. But now, watching the old man clutch his sign with trembling hands, those words took on new meaning. Had his father known something? Had he been trying to warn him? The king's carriage was now close enough that Marcus could see the ornate carvings on its golden surface. In moments, it would pass directly in front of them. His window of opportunity was closing. Soon the old man would be lost in the crowd again, taking his mysterious message with him. Just then, a gust of wind caught the sign, lifting it slightly. Marcus's heart stopped as more words came into view. "I was once where you are, standing guard over." The rest remained hidden, but those words alone sent shivers down his spine. How could this man know? How could he possibly know what it felt like to stand here, in this exact position? Unless he had stood here himself. The thought hit Marcus like a physical blow. His father had been more than just a warrior. He had been a royal guard himself, one of the elite. But that detail had been mysteriously absent from all official records of his service. Why? What else had been hidden? The old man's eyes never left Marcus's face, even as the crowd jostled around him. Those eyes, his father's eyes, held decades of untold stories, of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. There was something else there too, something that made Marcus's chest ache, a desperate plea for understanding. "Last warning," James muttered. "The king is almost here. Whatever's bothering you, bury it." But how could he bury something that had already been buried for 15 years? How could he ignore the possibility that everything he'd believed about his father's fate might be a lie? The royal trumpet sounded again, closer now. The crowd's cheering reached a fever pitch. The old man's lips moved, forming words that were lost in the noise. But Marcus could read them clearly. "Please, Tommy. Please see me." Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis. Time seemed to slow as the king's carriage approached, its wheels turning with agonizing deliberation. Each rotation brought him closer to a moment of choice, duty or truth, loyalty to the crown or loyalty to his heart. The old man reached into his tattered coat with trembling fingers, pulling something out that caught the morning light. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. A silver locket, his mother's locket, the same one she had given him as a child, the one that had disappeared the night his father vanished. He remembered its distinctive shape, the small nick on one corner where he had dropped it playing soldiers in the garden. "Focus, Marcus," James's urgent whisper barely registered. "The king is watching." Indeed, Marcus could feel the king's eyes upon him as the carriage drew near. The monarch's gaze held something beyond the usual regal detachment. Was it concern? Warning? For a fraction of a second, their eyes met, and Marcus saw something that chilled him to his core. Recognition. The king knew. He knew who the old man was. The locket swung gently in the morning breeze, and with it came another flood of memories. His father showing him how to open its tricky clasp, the small piece of paper hidden inside, bearing words his father had made him memorize. In times of darkness, truth becomes our only light. At the time, he'd thought it was just another of his father's philosophical sayings. Now, those words took on a new, urgent meaning. The crowd surged forward as the king's carriage passed, pushing the old man closer to the barrier. The sign tilted fully into view at last. and Marcus read the complete message that would shatter his world forever. I was once where you are, standing guard over lies. The truth will set us both free. Marcus's hands began to shake. His perfectly polished boots felt rooted to the ground. The weight of his uniform, once a source of pride, now felt like chains holding him in place. Every second of training, every lesson in discipline and duty warred against the desperate need to reach out, to grab that locket, to demand answers. A flicker of movement caught his eye. The king had raised his hand slightly, and two guards at the edge of the crowd began moving toward the old man. Their movements were casual, practiced. They'd done this before. How many times had they removed this man from royal events? How many times had his father tried to reach him, only to be silently swept away? They're going to take him, Marcus thought, panic rising in his chest. They're going to make him disappear again. The old man saw the approaching guards too. His eyes widened with a fear that seemed too familiar, too practiced. He clutched the locket tighter, his knuckles white with desperation. For a moment, he looked exactly like the father in Marcus's memories, proud, strong, determined. Then fear crept into his expression, the same fear Marcus had glimpsed on his father's face the morning he disappeared. "Last chance, son," the old man mouthed, his words clear despite the crowd's noise. "Last chance for the truth." The guards were only steps away now. One of them reached for the old man's arm, while the other moved to take the sign. They moved with the efficiency of men who had done this countless times before, erasing inconvenient truths from the kingdom's perfect facade. Marcus felt something break inside him, not his training or his discipline, but the wall he'd built around his doubts, his questions, his need for truth. His father's last words to him echoed in his mind. Sometimes the truth wears a mask. Had he been talking about the kingdom's lies? About his own forced disappearance? The king's carriage was directly in front of him now. Protocol demanded his complete attention, his unwavering focus. But for the first time in his 7 years of service, Marcus found himself unable to maintain the illusion. His eyes drifted to the old man, to his father, watching as the guards began to pull him away. "Tommy," his father whispered one last time, the locket glinting in his hand, "I never stopped trying to reach you." Marcus's world exploded into a cascade of memories. Each one hit him like a physical blow, filling in the gaps of a story he'd never fully understood. He remembered the night before his father disappeared, the hushed voices in his father's study, the sound of papers being burned, the strange men in dark cloaks leaving through the back door. He remembered his father sitting on his bed that night, looking at him with eyes full of unshed tears. "Tommy," he'd said, "remember that doing what's right isn't always the same as following orders." At the time, Marcus hadn't understood. He'd been too young to grasp the weight of those words, too innocent to see the storm gathering behind his father's eyes. Now, watching the guards drag his father away, those words burned in his mind. His father hadn't abandoned them. He hadn't died in battle. He'd discovered something the kingdom wanted to keep hidden, something worth destroying a man's life over, worth separating a father from his son. The king's carriage continued its slow procession, but Marcus barely saw it. His eyes were fixed on the locket in his father's trembling hand. The guards were being gentle but firm, their movements practiced and efficient. They weren't hurting him. They didn't need to. They were simply making him disappear, just as they had done countless times before. "Sir," James whispered urgently beside him, "whatever you're thinking, don't. It's not worth throwing away your career." Career? Marcus almost laughed. What was a career compared to 15 years of lies? What was status worth against the truth his father had sacrificed everything to reveal? His father's words from long ago echoed again. Sometimes the truth wears a mask. The Royal Guard's uniform had been Marcus's mask, hiding him from his own truth. Every perfect stance, every flawless parade, every proud moment of service had been built on a foundation of lies. The crowd continued to cheer, oblivious to the drama unfolding before them. To them, it was just another reminder of the kingdom's efficiency, a disturbing element being quietly removed, the perfect facade maintained. How many other truths had been erased this way? How many other families had been torn apart to protect the kingdom's secrets? One of the guards reached for the locket. Marcus saw his father's fingers tighten around it, saw the desperation in his eyes. The guard pulled harder, and the chain began to break. "Stop!" The word escaped Marcus's lips before he could stop it. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but in that moment of perfect discipline, it cut through the air like thunder. James grabbed his arm. "Marcus, no! Think about what you're doing." But Marcus was already thinking more clearly than he had in 15 years. Every step of his career, every promotion, every proud moment had been leading him away from the truth. He'd become the perfect guard, the perfect servant of the kingdom, while his father had spent years trying to break through that perfection to reach him. The king's carriage had passed them now, but Marcus felt the monarch's eyes on him still. There was something in that gaze, not just warning, but fear. What truth could be so dangerous that even the king feared its revelation? His father was still struggling weakly against the guards, but his eyes never left Marcus's face. Those eyes, his own eyes, held a lifetime of pain, of sacrifice, of desperate love that had never died. The locket dangled from his fingers, catching the sunlight like a signal fire. Marcus thought of his mother, how she'd never quite believed the official story, how she'd kept his father's things exactly as he'd left them, as if waiting for answers she knew would come. She'd died 2 years ago, never knowing the truth. Would Marcus let the same happen to him? James's grip on his arm tightened. "Think of your oath," he hissed. "Think of everything you've worked for." Marcus was thinking of it, all of it. Every morning spent polishing his boots to perfection. Every hour standing at attention. Every parade. Every ceremony. Every moment he'd spent becoming the perfect guard. He'd been moving further from who he really was. A son who had lost his father to lies. Without another moment of hesitation, Marcus took a single step forward. Just one step. But it shattered every rule, every protocol he'd lived by for the past 7 years. The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift in the air. Even the guards holding his father froze, unsure how to react to this unprecedented breach of conduct. "Return to your position," a sharp voice commanded. Marcus turned to see Captain Reynolds, the head of the Royal Guard, approaching with quick, purposeful strides. His face was a mask of controlled anger. "This is your only warning." Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the courtyard. The other guards watched in stunned silence. The crowd held their collective breath. His father stood motionless between the two guards, the locket still clutched in his trembling hand. "He's my father," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet courtyard. The words felt strange on his tongue. He hadn't spoken them in 15 years. "The man you're dragging away, he's my father." Captain Reynolds' expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something. Recognition? Fear? "Your father died in battle, Guard Marcus. We all attended the memorial. Now, return to your post." "No." Marcus took another step forward. Each movement felt like breaking through invisible chains. "That was the story we were told. But it wasn't true, was it, Captain?" The guards holding his father exchanged uncertain glances. They were trained to handle protesters, troublemakers, threats to the kingdom's peace. But a royal guard breaking ranks? This wasn't in their protocol. "Think carefully about your next move," Captain Reynolds warned, his hand resting on his sword hilt. 15 years of perfect service, Marcus. Don't throw it away over the ravings of a street beggar." But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on the locket in his father's hand. Memory after memory crashed through his mind. His father teaching him to swim in the river behind their house, showing him how to hold a sword, telling him stories of honor and truth late into the night. "The truth wears a mask," he'd said. The Royal Guard's uniform had been Marcus's mask, hiding him from his own truth. With deliberate movements, Marcus unbuckled his ceremonial sword belt, the symbol of his position, his authority, his dedication to the kingdom. The crowd gasped as it clattered to the cobblestones. "What are you doing?" James called out, his voice thick with concern. "Marcus, stop!" "My name," Marcus said clearly, "is Tommy, and that man is my father." He took another step forward. "Release him." Captain Reynolds moved faster than Marcus expected, placing himself between Marcus and the guards holding his father. "This is treason," he hissed, low enough that only Marcus could hear. "Think of your mother. Think of her sacrifice." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "My mother? What do you know about my mother?" A flicker of realization crossed the captain's face. He'd said too much. Behind him, Marcus's father suddenly struggled against the guards with renewed strength. "Tell him!" he shouted. "Tell him what you did to her!" The crowd was murmuring now, the perfect pageantry of the royal ceremony crumbling as the drama unfolded before them. Someone in the back started calling for the truth. Others joined in. "Last chance," Captain Reynolds said, drawing his sword. The sound of steel against scabbard cut through the growing noise. "Return to your post or join him in exile." Marcus looked at his father, really looked at him for the first time in 15 years. Behind the ragged clothes and weathered face, he saw the strength that had never broken, the love that had brought him back year after year, trying to reach his son. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Marcus stepped forward again, placing himself directly in front of Captain Reynolds' drawn sword. "Then I choose exile," he said clearly. "I choose the truth." A strange calm settled over Marcus as he stood facing the captain's blade. The morning sun caught the polished steel, sending ribbons of light dancing across the cobblestones. Behind him, he could hear his father's ragged breathing, the murmur of the crowd, the distant sound of the royal trumpets growing fainter. "You don't understand what you're doing," Captain Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a whisper. There was something different in his tone now, not anger, but fear. "Some truths are better left buried, Marcus. Your mother understood that." "My mother?" Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. "What do you mean she understood?" The captain's face paled slightly, realizing he'd said too much again. But Marcus's father let out a bitter laugh behind them. "Tell him, Reynolds. Tell him how you threatened her. Tell him how you forced her to keep silent all those years." The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the unprecedented scene of a royal guard breaking ranks. Their whispers grew louder, and Marcus caught fragments of conversation. His mother? The guard's father? What truth? Captain Reynolds' sword wavered slightly. "Your mother made her choice to protect you. She knew what would happen if the truth came out. The kingdom's stability." "The kingdom's lies!" Marcus's father shouted, struggling against the guards again. "Tell him what really happened that night. Tell him why you made me disappear." Marcus's mind raced back to his mother's final days, how she'd tried to tell him something, her voice weak with illness. "Tommy," she'd whispered, "your father, the papers, in the study." But before she could finish, the royal physician had arrived, ushering Marcus out of the room. When he'd returned, she'd been too weak to speak. "The papers?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking. "What papers?" Captain Reynolds' face hardened. "Evidence," he spat. "Evidence your father should have destroyed. Instead, he tried to expose everything, the missing tax money, the secret trials, the disappeared citizens. He would have torn the kingdom apart with his so-called truth." The crowd's whispers turned to gasps. Someone started writing frantically in a notebook. The perfect facade of the kingdom was cracking, truth spilling through like water through a broken dam. "My father was right," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "And you didn't just exile him. You threatened my mother to keep her quiet. You made her live with that knowledge until the day she died." The captain's sword pressed against Marcus's chest, but he barely felt it. All he could think about was his mother's face every time she'd told him his father died a hero. The pain in her eyes hadn't been from grief. It had been from the weight of lies she'd been forced to carry. "The locket," Marcus's father called out. "Show him what's in the locket." The guards holding him had loosened their grip, caught up in the unfolding drama. Marcus's father pulled free just enough to toss the silver locket through the air. Marcus caught it instinctively, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. "Don't," Captain Reynolds warned, but it was too late. Marcus's fingers found the hidden catch, the one his father had shown him so long ago. The locket sprang open, and a small folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground. As he bent to pick it up, he noticed something else inside the locket, a tiny key. "That key opens a compartment in your father's old study," Reynolds said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Where he kept copies of everything. We searched for years, but never found it. Your mother must have hidden the locket before we arrived that night." Marcus unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. On it, in his mother's delicate handwriting, were the words, "The truth isn't just in the papers, Tommy. It's in the names of everyone they made disappear. Your father tried to save them all. Now it's your turn to finish what he started." The sound of running feet made Marcus look up. More royal guards were approaching, their swords drawn. Behind them, he could see the king's carriage returning. The crowd pressed closer, phones raised to record every moment. "Arrest them both!" the king's voice rang out across the courtyard. He had stepped down from his carriage, his face dark with anger. This display has gone on long enough. But the crowd was too invested now. Years of whispered rumors, of unexplained disappearances, of families torn apart. It all bubbled to the surface. Someone shouted, "Let them speak!" Others took up the cry, their voices growing louder, more insistent. Marcus stood his ground, the locket in one hand, his mother's note in the other. Captain Reynolds' sword still pressed against his chest, but the captain's eyes kept darting between Marcus and the approaching king, uncertainty clear on his face. "You can't silence the truth forever," Marcus's father called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Every person you made disappear had a family. Every lie you told left scars. How many more lives will you destroy to keep your secrets?" The king's face twisted with rage. "You forget yourself, old man. Your accusations nearly tore this kingdom apart 15 years ago. Do you think anything has changed?" "Everything has changed," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "Because now we have proof." He held up the key from the locket. "Every name, every document, every truth you tried to bury. My mother kept it safe all these years." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Phones flashed as people recorded every word. The king's secrets were spilling out into the open, broadcast live across social media. There would be no hiding this time. "Your mother," the king spat, "was a fool who chose silence to save her son. Don't waste her sacrifice." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You're wrong," he said, understanding flooding through him. "She didn't choose silence. She chose the perfect moment. She knew that one day I would be here, wearing this uniform, close enough to expose everything." His father's eyes filled with tears of pride. "She always was the smartest of us all," he whispered. Captain Reynolds' sword wavered, then slowly lowered. "The missing tax money," he said quietly. "It wasn't just going to the king's treasury, was it? It was paying for the disappearances, the secret prisons, the bribes." "Silence!" the king commanded, but his voice held a note of desperation now. Marcus turned to face the crowd, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "My father discovered the truth 15 years ago. He found evidence of corruption that went all the way to the top. Instead of silencing him quickly, they made him disappear slowly, destroying his reputation, threatening his family, forcing him into exile. They thought that would be the end of it." He held up the locket. "But my mother outsmarted them. She hid the evidence where they'd never look, in a child's keepsake. She knew that one day, when the time was right, the truth would come out." The approaching guards had slowed their advance, looking uncertain. Some of them were younger than Marcus, recruited after his father's disappearance. How many of them had heard whispers of corruption? How many had seen things they couldn't explain? "I trusted you," Marcus said to the king, years of pain and betrayal flowing into his words. "We all trusted you, but you betrayed that trust, again and again. You didn't just steal money. You stole lives, families, hope itself." The crowd had grown deathly quiet, hanging on every word. The king's face had gone pale, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Behind him, his advisors were already backing away, distancing themselves from the impending fall. "The compartment in my father's study," Marcus continued, holding up the key. "It's still there, isn't it? Untouched all these years because you never found it. Everything we need to expose the truth. Names, dates, documents. My mother made sure of that." Captain Reynolds suddenly straightened, his decision made. He turned to face the king, placing himself between the monarch and Marcus. "Stand down," he ordered the approaching guards. "No more lies, no more disappearances." One by one, the other guards lowered their weapons. The crowd pressed closer, phones still recording every moment. The truth was spreading faster than any order to contain it. The king took a step backward, his composure cracking. "You don't understand," he said, his voice no longer commanding but pleading. "Everything I did was to maintain order, to keep the kingdom stable. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." "Sacrifices?" Marcus's father broke free from the distracted guards and walked toward his son. His voice trembled with 15 years of suppressed anger. You sacrificed other people's lives, other people's families. You sacrificed truth itself and called it stability. Marcus felt his father's presence beside him, solid and real after so many years of absence. The familiar scent of pine and wood smoke still clung to him, bringing back a flood of childhood memories. Without taking his eyes off the king, he reached out and grasped his father's hand. My mother knew this day would come, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard. That's why she never told me the truth herself. She knew I needed to find it on my own, to be in a position where my words would carry weight. He touched his royal guard uniform, understanding at last why she had encouraged him to follow this path. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his decision made. The evidence in the study, he said. We should retrieve it now, before... A sudden commotion near the palace gates interrupted him. More people were streaming into the courtyard, but these weren't ordinary citizens. Marcus recognized faces he'd seen in old photographs, families of the disappeared. They must have been watching the live streams, recognizing the moment they had waited years for. My brother, a woman called out, pushing through the crowd. He spoke out against the tax increases 10 years ago. The next day he vanished. Is his name in those documents? My mother, another voice joined in. She worked in the palace treasury. She said she found discrepancies in the accounts, and then... More voices joined the chorus, years of silence finally breaking. Each story was different, but they all ended the same way. With someone disappearing, with official lies, with families left to wonder and grieve. The king's face had gone ashen. His guards were backing away, no longer willing to defend him. The carefully maintained facade of his reign was crumbling in real time, broadcast across social media for the whole world to see. Tommy, Marcus's father said softly, using his childhood name. The key. Marcus looked down at the small key in his hand, then at his father's weathered face. We'll need witnesses, he said, people to document everything we find. I'll go, Captain Reynolds offered, surprising everyone. I've helped maintain these lies for too long. Let me help expose them. Everything you find will be used against you, the king warned, but his words carried no weight now. The kingdom will descend into chaos. No, Marcus said firmly. The kingdom will heal. Truth doesn't destroy. It cleanses. His father's grip tightened on his hand. Your mother would be so proud, he whispered. She never lost faith that this day would come. The crowd parted as Marcus, his father, and Captain Reynolds began walking toward the palace. More people fell in behind them. Citizens, journalists, families of the disappeared. Each step felt like a victory, a reclaiming of truth too long buried. Wait, the king called out, his voice desperate. What about order? What about stability? Marcus turned back one last time, looking at the man he had served so faithfully. Real stability, he said, can only be built on truth. My mother taught me that. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the courtyard. As they walked toward his father's old study, toward the evidence that would change everything, Marcus felt the weight of his royal guard uniform falling away. He was no longer a guard bound by false duty. He was a son honoring his parents' sacrifice, a man choosing truth over power. Behind them, the crowd's whispers grew into a chant. Truth! 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 Exclamation mark. The walk to his father's old study felt both eternal and instantaneous. Every step brought back memories of playing in these halls as a child, of his father's warm laughter echoing off the marble walls, of his mother's quiet strength as she protected the truth all these years. When they reached the study door, Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a room frozen in time. Everything was exactly as he remembered. The heavy wooden desk, the wall of books, the faded curtains his mother had sewn herself. There, his father said softly, pointing to the large portrait of their family hanging on the wall. Behind that frame, there's a hidden compartment. Your mother, she was so clever. They searched this room dozens of times, but never thought to look there. Marcus stepped forward and carefully lifted the portrait. Behind it, just as his father had said, was a small door set into the wall. The key from the locket fit perfectly. When he turned it, The mechanism clicked softly, and the door swung open. Inside was a thick folder, its pages yellow with age but perfectly preserved. As Marcus pulled it out, a small envelope fell to the floor. On it, in his mother's handwriting, was his name. His real name, Tommy. "Read it," his father urged gently. "Your mother wrote that the night before they took me away." With shaking hands, Marcus opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Tommy, if you're reading this, then everything your father and I hoped for has come to pass. You've grown into a man strong enough to stand for truth, even when that truth comes at a great cost. Your father didn't abandon us. He discovered evidence of crimes that went to the very heart of the kingdom. When he refused to stay silent, they gave him a choice: disappear or watch his family suffer the same fate as so many others. He chose to protect us, but he never stopped fighting for justice. And I never stopped protecting the evidence that would one day set things right. The uniform you wear now, I encouraged you toward it, not because I believed in the kingdom's lies, but because I knew that one day the truth would need a voice from within. The documents in this compartment tell the full story, not just of your father's exile, but of every family torn apart, every life destroyed to protect the powerful. It's a heavy burden, my son, but I know you're strong enough to bear it. Remember, the truth isn't just in these papers. It's in every tear shed by those left behind, every silent prayer for justice, every act of courage in the face of power. Your father showed that courage 15 years ago. Now it's your turn. I may not be there to see this day, but know that I am so proud of you, my brave boy. You've become exactly the man we hoped you would be. With all my love, Mom." Marcus looked up from the letter to find tears streaming down his face. His father was crying too, one hand resting on his son's shoulder. Captain Reynolds stood respectfully at the door, keeping the growing crowd of witnesses at bay. "She never lost faith," his father said quietly. "In you, in the truth, in justice itself." Marcus wiped his eyes and turned to the thick folder of evidence. "Then let's make her proud. Let's make it all mean something." For the next several hours, they methodically documented everything. Journalists photographed every page. Families of the disappeared found the proof they had sought for years. The king's crimes were exposed one by one, each revelation adding to the weight of justice. As the sun began to set, Marcus and his father finally stepped out of the study. The crowd had grown even larger, but they fell silent as Marcus addressed them. "For 15 years, this kingdom has been built on lies," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtyard. "Those lies cost me my father, my mother, and countless other families their loved ones. But today, truth has won. Today, we start rebuilding, not on secrets and fear, but on justice and honesty." He turned to his father, seeing not the weathered man in ragged clothes, but the proud warrior who had first taught him about honor. "You never stopped trying to reach me," he said softly. His father smiled, tears in his eyes. "And you never stopped being the son we raised you to be." Together, they walked out of the palace, leaving behind the weight of secrets and the burden of lies. The crowd parted before them, phones still recording, but Marcus didn't care anymore about protocols or appearances. He was no longer a royal guard bound by false duty. He was simply a son walking with his father, choosing truth over power, love over lies, justice over order. Behind them, the setting sun painted the palace walls in shades of gold, as if marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The truth, so long buried, had finally broken free. And in that freedom, both father and son found something they had lost 15 years ago. Not just each other, but themselves.